So after many years of delay, we have finally gotten the premiere of the first episode of the UZUMAKI anime, which is of course based upon the manga written by legendary author Junji Ito. And if for some reason you don't know, Junji Ito is kind of known as the Stephen King of manga, of creating various short horror stories. Instead of creating a long, ongoing manga series like many other creators do, Junji Ito instead has kind of done this sort of anthology where he's created multiple very famous, very renowned horror stories within the medium of manga. Some coming up with his own original stories, and he's also adapted known stories like Frankenstein from Mary Shelley, or even No Longer Human, which is a famous novel in Japan as well that he's done a manga adaptation for. So he's no stranger to the dark and the macabre, and Uzumaki was actually the very first manga that I ever read from Junji Ito, and still to this day is my favorite Junji Ito story. I will link my review to the manga down below, but this is it right here. And this was being talked about being created into an anime version for quite some time. I believe the first trailer released for it was back in like 2020. Multiple delays happened for multiple reasons, and it got to the point where I couldn't even remember if this anime was actually going to come out or not. It finally premiered yesterday, at least episode 1. I'm not sure how many episodes it's going to be in its entirety, but episode 1 is out now, and you can watch it on HBO Max if you have that. I would highly recommend you do so, because I do think that this is starting the horror season outright. And even if you're not a big anime fan or manga fan, I think Junji Ito is one of those writers that can really kind of bridge the gaps. You know, like, I talk a lot about a lot of anime and a lot of horror movies on this channel because those are two things that I'm into a lot. I have found that they don't have as much crossover as I would think that they do, but Junji Ito might be the missing link in between the two in order to kind of bring us all together. And since we're getting into October, technically still the end of September right now, but with the premiere of Uzumaki and the leaves changing and the seasons getting colder, I feel like we're stepping into that spooky Halloween season. So why not start it right off the bat with Uzumaki. When it comes to the Uzumaki anime in particular, instead of just reviewing the story, although I guess I will give you a brief synopsis and a brief overview, but it's kind of tricky to talk about because there's so many different moving pieces. Essentially, all that you need to know is that a strange, haunting curse is befalling this small town in the product of spirals. In many different ways, people are either becoming obsessed with the image of a spiral. People are being drawn and gravitated towards spirals. There are spirals appearing in the way that the river flows, or even within the clouds above them. And what starts out is this strange little thing. Even the manga starts with the one character talking about his dad just kind of being obsessed with spirals and wanting somebody to make a spiral pottery for him, and he needs the water to be moving in a spiral in order to take a bath. And just these little weird things that kind of start the beginning of the story, but then as it goes on, as each individual situation gets worse and worse, this curse of the spiral that is befalling the town, which sounds very silly in concept, turns out to be pretty haunting and terrifying, especially with a lot of the imagery that Junji Ito is able to draw, making it feel like this darkly gothic horror setting that we need this to feel like. And I think the anime is capturing that very, very well. Without giving away anything, just talking pure aesthetically, the anime decided to create itself looking almost exactly like the Junji Ito artwork and keeping itself in the black and white format, because most of, if not all, manga is presented in black and white, and very few manga are colorized. However, when I read Junji Ito, and I thought this even before seeing the Uzumaki anime, is that it feels, a lot of his stories feel very much like a strange and spooky concept that would be in a classic Twilight Zone episode, and I'm a huge fan of the Twilight Zone. I don't know how many people are watching the Twilight Zone these days, because most of us have streaming, and if you don't seek it out naturally, you don't really get the New Year's Eve marathons that they used to play. But I was obsessed with Twilight Zone when I was younger, and I still think that most of the episodes are incredible and hold up very well today. They are just these short, episodic, every episode is its own thing, and it's this either sci-fi or existential kind of crisis episode, horror episodes. It was limited by the time of the 50s when it came out, but I still think the concepts and the ideas that they talk about in the Twilight Zone episodes deeply resonate even to this day in many, many different ways. And whenever I read Junji Ito, whether it's this story or Tomie or Hellstar Remina, even though it goes far beyond the capabilities of what you would be able to do in a Twilight Zone episode in the 50s with the artwork and the grand scope of things, it very much fits that feeling, that vibe, and that tone. And what I loved about the anime sticking to the traditional artwork as well as keeping itself in black and white is that it really took me back to those days of the Twilight Zone, and it definitely feels like that sort of old school horror vibe, or even like an old school black and white movie like a Carnival of Souls or something like that, where these weird, strange, creepy things are happening, and the imagery of seeing it in black and white makes it even scarier than it would be if it were in color, particularly when dealing with Uzumaki as well. When you're dealing with this image of the spiral, there's something very specific about that black on white that is just kind of going in this circularized pattern that I just think works way better in black and white than it would in color. So as far as a aesthetic choice for the anime goes, I think that this was the perfect direction to take it, and I really can't imagine it any other way. There are some moments of the animation that might feel a little bit stunted, but I think that they are focusing on one specific image, like of a character walking, and it looks like the background's not really moving. But there's something about that aesthetic that works for me because it feels like the entire town or their entire environment around them is, I guess, possessed or haunted in a way, and we have our one main character that's kind of outside of that, just starting to subtly notice the situation. Because that's a big part of the story too, is that this stuff is already going on, and our characters are noticing way too late. You know, the curse of the spiral has already begun to take an effect, and they are just kind of forced to deal with the fallout of that. Now, the other big difference in the anime as opposed to the manga is that each kind of haunting story of the spiral is almost individualized in the manga. There's a little bit of crossover, but the story of the main character's dad that you see in episode 1 was kind of its own chapter, and then dealing with the aftermath of that with his mother is kind of its own chapter. The kid that we see getting bullied in this first episode, there's a lot more to his story, but that's its own chapter in the manga. So the anime is kind of presenting all of these things happening at once or simultaneously, as opposed to just focusing on one individual thing. And I can kind of understand the reason why, because you can't really make an entire full 25-minute episode based upon one of the stories. I think it would fall short. If anything, you would have to do 2 chapters, like 2 stories per episode. You know, if they do that, like part A, commercial break, and then part B, you'd have to do it kind of that way. So I think turning it into an episodic anime, if they were going to do it into a movie, I could understand doing like chapters and adapting it all kind of individually like an anthology. But since they're doing an anime series that I don't know how many episodes it's going to last, I think it makes sense to kind of show everything happening at the same time. Really, what I wanted out of this series and what the Junji Ito mangas give me is that feeling of atmosphere, that feeling of immersion, you know, which is obviously very different if you're reading a manga or if you're watching an anime. And both of them are going to end up being very different because of the way that they're presented and like, you know, like the chapter sort of more episodic feeling of the manga as opposed to how the anime is doing it. But I think that both of them really kind of throw you right into the midst of things. You know, that's kind of one of the best parts about it too, is that you don't really get any time to settle in. There's no moment kind of building up the explanation to what's going on. You literally just start the story and you're in the midst of the curse, and we're just hearing the things that are happening around the town, and as it starts to unfold, you know, it's going to pile on so much worse than how it starts. And how it starts is also incredibly creepy. The main promotional image of the first episode and of the anime in its entirety is, of course, the girl that has the caved in kind of spiral face. And that story is pretty much spelled out to its entirety within the first episode, where, without spoiling too much, she gets a little bit of a mark on her forehead, and it forms in the shape of a spiral, which is suddenly gravitating all of these boys towards her. They suddenly start to like her a lot more after she's had this weird wound on her forehead that starts to get more devastating as time goes on. It is effectively creepy. The animation worked very well for me, and I think it's able to fulfill what the manga was able to accomplish in a different way, but in a way that's just as effective. So yeah, so far there's not a whole lot to comment on. The first episode was only about 25 minutes, but I did very much enjoy it. And after hearing about this anime coming out for multiple years now, what would happen is a trailer would come out and I would be excited, and then the anime would never drop and I would forget about it, and then there would be another trailer a year later and I'd be like, oh, okay, it's coming out now. And then it still hasn't come out. So now it's finally here. And I love that they're dropping it right at this time, right at the beginning of October, kind of luring us into the holiday horror season. And I think this is definitely one to check out, not just for manga fans, but also for horror fans. I think this is a good blend of the two, whereas I feel like my whole channel is a blend of the two, you know? And it's like, it always is fascinating to me how there isn't as much of a crossover as I would think. But I think Junji Ito and his stories and his manga are definitely like what is needed to kind of bridge that gap. So if you're a horror fan, I would say check out Junji Ito to get into manga. And if you're a manga fan, use Junji Ito as a jumping off point to kind of delve into horror a little bit more, because I think you are capable of loving both just the same. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Let me know what you think of the first episode of Junji Ito's Uzumaki, the anime, now premiering on Adult Swim. But like I said, if you have the HBO Max app streaming service, you can watch it there, and I'm sure other people will find other ways to watch it. However you do your thing, I highly recommend checking it out. Let me know what you think about it down below. Leave your thoughts, comments, opinion. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And if you want to support the channel on a deeper level, I'd appreciate it if you did so. Every little bit helps. I have a Patreon where I upload all the progress of the retrospectives I'm working on and occasional movie commentaries. There's also channel memberships, but I appreciate the support nonetheless. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll talk to you later.